Greetings everyone and welcome to week 9 in which we will be looking at the third part of our course titled Alliteration, Pirates. So we've already seen our popes and our princes, both in the Machiavellian sense, and princes as the Grand Dukes were understood to be. Despite the fact that they were indeed dukes, they were lumped under the heading of Christian princes, just like every other major leader of a nation-state empire or other dominion within the realm of Western Christianity. So, this week we come at last to pirates. We've now firmly entered the 17th century, and this is the age in which European seafaring really becomes an art form, a profession, and increasingly a tool for states to rise to dominance. Now it's true that the long-distance European sea voyaging really begins in the late 15th century. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and all that. But it takes a good century or so for the technology of sailing to be adapted to large-scale European expansion. And indeed, we might begin this week by looking at some of the key technological advances that permitted Europeans to make successful journeys westward to the New World. So, some of our goals for this week are first, to understand why the sea and seafaring, and really everything to do with maritime activity, became so important for the Grand Dukes of Tuscany and really the majority of European powers in the late 16th and early 17th century. So why this preoccupation with the dominance of the sea? Secondly, who was involved in these maritime schemes? So from the simplest Barbary pirates to the commanders of navies, we'll take a look at the people who worked, fought, and lived at sea in the employ of European and other princes. And I should say at this point that we're taking a rather Eurocentric approach because it's within the confines of our course. But there are other ways to tell this story, certainly from, for example, the Ottoman perspective. But in this case, we are taking a admittedly Eurocentric approach. Lastly, for our goals for this week, we need to understand how maritime dominance was attained by the Grand Dukedom and other states, what sort of tools were at their disposal. It's here that we'll be particularly focusing on piracy, or perhaps more correctly in the case of the Grand Dukes, privateering. We'll explore the difference between piracy and privateering and the places where these activities took place. Continuing our discussion from previous weeks, we'll return to the Grand Duke city of Livorno and see how it was used not only as a base for the Grand Duke's privateering fleet, the Knights of St. Stephen, but also how it was used to capitalize on new trends in global commerce and maritime activity, in which the city was transformed into an ideal place for commerce and for another very lucrative maritime activity, the selling of prizes, ships that were captured during the course of wars or other battles that were then auctioned off at Livorno's Asta Pubblica, which is the prize court where auctions, public auctions, took place. So let's begin in the year 1591, and we'll work both forwards and backwards from there. It was in this year that the first of two decrees, the famous Leggi Livornine, also known as the Livornine Constitution or the Livornine Laws, were published. You'll be reading some statutes from these for your primary source for this week. The official decree handed down by Ferdinando I de' Medici, so Ferdinand I de' Medici, was part of a larger strategy by the Medici to bolster Tuscany's economy and to become a bigger player on the European stage. Um, for right now, for a moment, let's consider the political state of things in late 16th century Europe and the Mediterranean. Certain technological advances in seafaring, dating from the 13th century, made transoceanic voyages in the 15th and 16th centuries possible. Among these, some of the most important were the astrolabe, pictured left there. It's the bronze medallion-looking uh, instrument on the black background, um, which it's a tool that permitted mariners to measure distances at sea using celestial bodies. The design and use of which had been perfected in Islamicate civilizations long before it entered common use among Europeans. Another crucial invention was the compass, which was invented centuries previously in China using a lodestone and the spoon-like construction you see here at the bottom on the blue background, which was known as a south pointer. And it's the mariner's compass. Its 16th century counterpart, 16th, 17th century counterpart is to the right. And above, we have portolan charts, like the one depicted here. So this was likely an ornamental chart. Real charts, ones that were actually used on ships, would not have been so decorative, nor would they have survived in such good shape. And these helped mariners measure distances between ports using rhumb lines. Rhumb lines are the lines you see crisscrossing the Mediterranean, which is depicted here. Additionally, new, more seaworthy, larger ships were invented in the 15th century, and it was these carracks, especially later galleons, that explorers like Columbus and Magellan would use to explore the New World, and later Spain, of course, would employ galleons to transport its precious cargoes of silver back to Europe. Spain had reached the height of its overseas empire in really the 17th century, the early 17th century, and over the course of the 17th century it would become ever less potent as it struggled to rule its vast territorial empire. It was continually plagued by piratical attacks by Francis Drake in particular, among others, of course, who captured its galleons and attacked its ports. So here we see a map of English expansion, of European expansion in 17th, 16th, 17th centuries. And you have Spain in green, English in pink, yellow French, and you can also see Dutch and Portuguese holdings, just as a kind of quick overview of some of the major voyages that took place also in the 16th century and to a certain extent late 15th century. But returning to pirates and privateers, it was this kind of use of what the Spanish were calling piratical attacks, but what were seen by the English as a legitimate form of warfare that weakened some of the Spanish power in the New World, and really continued to be a thorn in its side, as well as for the Portuguese, over the course of the late 16th, early 17th century. And later, of course, the commercial ambitions of the English would put them into direct competition with the Dutch. By the late 16th century, the Spanish had grown so fed up with English predations that they amassed an armada designed not only to crush the English maritime forces, but also to conquer England itself, where Protestant Elizabeth I had been declared a heretic and her rule illegitimate by the Pope. King Philip of Spain's mighty armada was destroyed by a combination really of luck and expertise. The English ships were more nimble than the larger Spanish galleons, and the English use of fire ships, so these were literally ships that were set on fire and then sailed into the midst of the larger fleet. These tactics were able to reduce the Armada's numbers, and then a brutal storm, the so-called Protestant wind, blew up and destroyed over a third of the fleet as it sort of limped on its way back to Spain. Though the English would not have a well-organized navy until the mid-17th century under Oliver Cromwell, they were recognized to be some of the best navigators and privateers available. A fact which will become crucial later in the reign of Ferdinando I de' Medici, who actually employed many English sailors and captains in his fleets. I'll return to that point a bit later in this lecture. So we might say that after 1571, after the Battle of Lepanto, the entire continent and coastal Mediterranean powers were due for a shakeup. The battle, which I've explained before, pitted Christian powers led by Venice against the Ottoman fleet, and it decimated the Turkish powers, but it also exhausted the arsenals of the Christians in the process. Later, the defeat of the Armada, the Spanish Armada, meant that Spanish naval forces were for a time severely reduced. This opens up greater opportunity for the English and Dutch to sail into the Mediterranean and to take over trades that were previously managed by Italians. It also crucially created a maritime power vacuum in the absence of large Venetian and Ottoman fleets to patrol the sea. As your secondary reading, Molly Green's chapter on piracy and privateering will explain, this provided the regional powers of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, also Salé, even if it's not marked on this map here, who were in theory vassal sort of principalities who swore allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan, but in practice often acted independently of Turkish official policy. So these powers took the opportunity to use their own local fleets to engage in privateering or corsairing, that is, capturing enemy ships, whoever the enemy may be for that given period, and bring them back to their home ports, where the ships and their contents would be sold, and the sailors on the captured ships would be either sold into captivity, or they could be press ganged onto other ships to work as crew, depending upon their religious and political affiliations. So this was a form of marauding, of maritime marauding, that was seen certainly by the regional powers of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to be perfectly legitimate. They supplied these privateers often with letters of marque or other types of permits, with official papers, if you will, that were, if not in form, at least in theory, the same as the letters of marque that, say, an English sovereign or a French sovereign would issue to their subjects to go and to capture ships that were manned by the enemy, whether it was France at war with Spain in that period, or England with Spain, or Portugal with whomever. So that's the difference between a pirate who acts independently and a privateer who acts in the employ of what is considered to be a legitimate sovereign. So in your reading for this week, Molly Green presents the world of the Mediterranean as characterized by religious dichotomy of Christian versus Ottoman, of a world in which religious differences would remain the key deciding factor in shaping people's allegiances and identities. I would like to problematize her argument a little bit, taking Tuscany, Livorno, and the way that the Tuscan Navy developed to highlight what I consider to be a much more complex, and even hybrid reality on the ground. So Green does certainly take pains to point out that there are some contradictions in this world of the 17th century Mediterranean, places where, like in Livorno, multiple faiths lived side by side with relatively little conflict. In recent years, historians' attention has shifted more and more to these places of coexistence, to these bazaars or marketplaces, rather than battlefields, if you will, which is a phrasing that's been coined by Eric Derstiller. And both he and E. Natalie Rothman are two historians who've written some very good books recently on the subject of coexistence and the nature of coexistence and cosmopolitanism in the Mediterranean. So I recommend them definitely. But first, let's take a step back and take a look at the battlefield mentality, a world of religious dichotomy, of religious competition. The argument that depicts the Mediterranean as insuperably divided along religious lines. So there's certainly truth in that view, especially when you focus on large-scale conflicts and events that shape the form of organized religion. The 16th century was certainly a century of vast religious change. This was kicked off in part by our own Medici Pope, Leo X, whose money grubbing with his indulgences infuriated Martin Luther and fueled a continent-wide Protestant revolution. So the Catholic Church, in response to the fracturing of its faith, but also as a move to resolve long-standing problems within its own organization, held the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563 in the northern Italian cities of Trent and Bologna. This hugely important meeting of the leaders of the Catholic Church resulted in a number of reforms designed to combat heresy and to expand the Church's power. And as Molly Green explains in your reading, the Church also launched a campaign to attract converts from the Eastern Mediterranean. But not only. The 16th century also saw the rise of the Jesuit order, whose fierce allegiance to the Pope and religious zeal led them to become a powerful force in the New World, where they engaged in sometimes very bloody and very ruthless campaigns to convert the native inhabitants. Meanwhile, in 1555, Pope Pius IV had, with his papal decree Cum Nimis Absurdum, ordered that the Jews in the Papal States, so in the region of Italy that's controlled by the Church directly, these Jews who lived in various cities had to be confined within ghettos. So they were walled quarters that were locked at night. They were also required to wear an external marker of their faith. So men had to wear a pointed yellow hat, and women had to wear either a yellow handkerchief or a sort of badge. They were also limited in their economic activities. So they were permitted to deal in the second-hand clothing trade, while other activities that would normally see them interacting with Christians were also forbidden. For example, Jewish doctors were prohibited from treating Christian patients. So there's a real hyper-anxiety about the mixing of faith within the Papal States. It's something that is very present in the minds of Catholic reformers at this time. But in Tuscany, being the Grand Duke had its advantages, and Ferdinando and his successors were able to block many of the papal and inquisitorial restrictions on non-Catholics and on Jews. Ferdinando was keenly aware of the commercial advantages that could come to his state if Jews, and particularly Sephardic Jews, so Jews that originally came from the Iberian Peninsula, from Portugal and Spain, but had then scattered after the Spanish Reconquista and after the edict that forced them out in 1492. So these Jews were still very commercially powerful and had vast networks that spanned the Mediterranean and the European continent. And the idea was to attract them to come and settle in Tuscany and to bring their lucrative connections with them. Hence, the Leggi Livornine, the Livornine laws that were decreed in 1591 and in 1593. But we've run into a little bit of a paradox here, because at the same time that Ferdinand was inviting the Jews, whom the Pope had just said were condemned by God for their part, for example, in the persecution of Jesus, at the same time, Ferdinand opens the gates to these heretics. He engages on a very purposeful crusade to root out other infidels, using his Knights of St. Stephen. So this order, which was founded, as you will remember, by Cosimo I, and was expanded later by Ferdinand, had the express purpose of fighting for the Fede di Cristo, which is the Christian faith. So what are we to do with this apparent paradox? On the one hand, you have a city that is built expressly for the purpose of attracting multiple faiths and people of multiple backgrounds, cultural and ethnic, to settle, and really, hopefully, to bring in a profit for the Grand Duke and also for Tuscany in general. And on the other hand, you have the expansion of a privateering force whose explicit concern is to round up non-Catholics, particularly Muslims, Turks, Moors, North Africans, and to oftentimes sell them into slavery, to bring them back to Livorno, where the Bagno, where this large prison had been built for that explicit purpose. Here we see the inside of the Church of the Order of St. Stephen, which is in Pisa, in the Piazza dei Cavalieri, which was the institutional base of the Knights of St. Stephen. In the Piazza, they often held military processions, and within the church itself, here you see displayed some of the captured pennants and bandiere, the flags of Ottoman, Turkish, Moorish fleets. On the right there you can see them posted on the wall, along with parts of the old galleons that used to sail as part of the fleet. And really, the Knights of St. Stephen become very much a part of the elite level of Florentine society, as we've discussed in previous lectures. So on the one hand, again, we have Livorno being established, in which Jewish merchants and really merchants of many different faiths are welcome, even encouraged to settle. And on the other hand, you have a military religious order that's been established explicitly for the eradicating of the infidel, or rather, not eradicating, but certainly the capture of Muslim, non-Catholic, Muslim particularly, ships. and the selling of their contents and their cargoes and their people into slavery. Well, really, I would argue that this is no paradox at all, but rather that it signifies a certain sort of cosmopolitan, conflictual cosmopolitan, but cosmopolitan nonetheless, notion of existence in the Mediterranean. While other historians continue to see this era in terms of religious dichotomies, so Christian versus Muslim, Protestant versus Catholic, I believe that instead the Mediterranean in this period should be viewed more in terms of dynamic hybridity, of a sort of shifting cosmopolitanism, of cultures and faiths that would and could clash in certain spheres and coexist more or less peacefully in others. Um, for example, the Ottoman Empire, in which you have Christian merchants, French, Italian, Dutch, English, settling in various ports, also in other large trading towns like Aleppo, who are actually protected under agreements that are signed between the sovereigns of the Christian nations and the Ottoman Sultan. These were known as the capitulations, the treaties drawn up between the two or more powers. So there is much to question, I believe, with this view of the Mediterranean in the 17th century as still dominated by religious difference. So while it's true that the experience for some of these slaves was extremely dismal, especially for example, the Ottoman galley slaves who were quite literally chained to the oars that they sat at and spent their life there. They slept there, they ate there, they defecated there, everything took place there. And it was considered almost a fate worse than death to be condemned to work as a galley slave. But other slaves ended up in much different situations. Some became domestic servants, others ended up working in diplomatic services, serving as interpreters and that sort of thing. And they could earn money, and they could also buy their way out of captivity. This was always facilitated, of course, if they chose to convert to Islam. Contrary to what some people might think, it is against Muslim doctrine, generally speaking, to forcibly convert people. So the Prophet himself considered that a forced conversion was no true conversion. So these were people who, if they hadn't 100% committed to the idea of conversion in their heart, for example, at least expressed the desire to convert in a compelling enough manner that they convinced those around them that they had actually converted to Islam. In which case, they would then, be freer to either stay or leave, depending upon their relationship with their then master. It's odd though, because you do read captivity narratives in which some of these men who had been formerly so very, very low level people on the social scale who worked in hard labor or who had kind of dismal lives, sailing or working in other trades, decide actually to stay because they find the climate enjoyable and the food is good. And there are a whole host of other reasons, social and cultural, that lead them actually to have a better experience living in North Africa or in other parts of the Ottoman dominions. So it can't be taken at face value when you read a captivity narrative or you see images of the previous one that just showed you that that these were all horrible experiences. I mean, a lot of these things became this sort of virulent anti-Turkish propaganda that was then used to kind of drum up a warlike sentiment during various naval campaigns, which of course did take place because the privateering and piracy continued to be a big problem to such extent that it was also a big financial drain. You have In the case of English captives, for example, their loved ones or their wives generally would take up collections to free them from captivity, or they would go before Parliament and ask for money or assistance in buying the freedom, essentially, of their relative who was kept in captivity. The French actually had their own religious order that was devoted to rescuing French captives who were held in Muslim lands. So it's not until the mid-17th century that a serious assault on centers of North African privateering by European forces takes place. The admiral of the English Navy under Cromwell, Blake, for example, he bombed Algiers in 1655, and subsequently other North African outposts came under increased pressure to cease their privateering, increased pressure both from Europeans and at times their Ottoman superiors. But I should note that all of this, the slave trading or press ganging or voluntary enrollment in foreign navies meant that the actual crews on each ship that one encountered in the Mediterranean could and often were very multinational. And not just the common sailors either. You often have captains who who hail from one country and are serving the sovereign of another. So we can take, for instance, the case of Robert Dudley. Robert Dudley was the illegitimate son of Sir Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, but he fails to get his inheritance in England, and he's very much upset by this. As a young man, he took part in frequent transatlantic voyages. He was quite the adventurer. But when he is cheated to his mind out of his inheritance, he leaves his wife and children in England and elopes. He remarries in France, and he also converts to Catholicism. And his many years of naval experience bring him to the attention of the Grand Duke Ferdinando. And what he does is sort of enroll in the Grand Duke's service. He redesigns the ships of the Grand Duke's Navy. He updates various designs for the arsenal, but also for the port of Livorno itself. And he has a very important role also in organizing the only attempt, really, of Tuscany to establish a colony in the New World. So this was an expedition that took place in 1608, coincidentally exactly 1 year before the death of Grand Duke Ferdinando. And Robert Dudley helped organize an outfit, a voyage that was conducted by two brothers, Robert and Giles Thornton, which was designed to explore the New World, particularly the coast of Brazil and the mouth of the Amazon River, to see if it was feasible to establish a colony of Tuscan Florentines in the New World. Thornton and his brother arrive. They have some problems with mutineers, but they do manage to make it back with 5 or 6 Carib, as they were then called, native inhabitants of the area in tow. And unfortunately, all but one of these poor prisoners dies on the way back to the New World, but he apparently learns Italian and becomes a sort of page boy scribe at the court of the Grand Duke. It's a little bit like the Pocahontas situation in the New World and the English community in Jamestown. So he essentially helps outfit new ships. He helps plan the port of Livorno. He is in basically in all but name the sort of commanding admiral of the Grand Duke's forces, and he sets himself up in a very handsome house in the middle of Florence, which coincidentally, if you go and visit it today, it has the shape kind of like the bow of a ship. So he was always concerned with nautical affairs. And this voyage was never repeated. It was the only attempt of the Tuscan sovereigns to establish a foothold in the New World. But it was important because they were able to learn a great deal in terms of and gain nautical experience from the voyage. But really, one of Dudley's lasting contributions, not only to Tuscany but really to the nautical arts, was his naval manual, which is the Dell'Arcano del Mare, which is roughly translated as like the secrets of the sea, which included ship diagrams, hundreds of maps. It was the first to use the Mercator projection, and it also had a compendious atlas of nautical advice, the scope of which had really never been attempted before. And the publishing of this compendium of nautical advice was really a turning point in the developing art of seafaring in European states. So again, I mentioned that the late 16th and really going into the 17th century is a time of revolution in shipbuilding, especially for the English, but also for other European powers. We move from a sort of mixed rigged ship, which you have a square rig, which is square sail, and the triangular, lateen sail, which is depicted there on the Portuguese caravel, to a square rigged ship, in which you have several masts that are all fitted out with square sails. And this is really the optimum shape to capture the wind, and it greatly increases the the length of time at which a ship can stay at sea, the speed, and the overall kind of seaworthiness of the craft. And ships at this time are also growing really larger and heftier because they have to support the weight of cannons. Gunpowder, the development of new uses of gunpowder and new types of cannonry were also one of the factors that really pushed European expansion, and in particular the growth of certain nations, the English, the Dutch, to the forefront of naval science. So cannons, both at land and at sea, became more precise and more powerful, and what's more simply more reliable. There are many accounts of the Ottomans or Italians, and really any other bellicose leader, rolling out these massive, new, shiny, specially cast bronze cannons, only for them to explode to pieces with the very first shot. So thankfully, well, for the poor gunners at least, they were able to finesse the casting process over the 16th and 17th centuries. This meant, among other things, that both architecture on land and at sea had to change to adapt to the new technology. At sea, the rowed galley ships couldn't take the heavy weight of the cannonry, but the larger and more reinforced ships of the English and Dutch could to devastating effect. The older way of doing warfare at sea was based really on hand-to-hand combat. So you would launch a series of grappling hooks over to the enemy's galley, you would bring it alongside, and then you'd fight across the decks. And this meant that the crews of these ships were often more soldiers than sailors when setting out to war. With the advances in cannonry and the new extent of its use, ship architecture and ship battles changed, shifting more to the alongside exchange of cannonballs that, for instance, you see in pirate movies nowadays. But another important change was on land. fort construction used to feature these high rounded towers from which archers could rain down arrows on their enemies. But both the height and the shape of these towers made them vulnerable. Now those who were being besieged were not dealing with like trebuchets, but with heavy cannonry, with gunpowder-based cannon that could easily bring down the high rounded towers. So these towers were also an inefficient use of space because they had sort of dead zones in which the attackers could approach the defenders where the defenders couldn't reach them. So with new star-pointed forts, which was known as the traces italiennes in French, which is basically because they originate in Italy, this problem of resistance to cannon fire and sort of dead zone was eliminated. These star forts, as they come to be known, are adopted right across Europe. And Livorno was considered one of the most exemplary forms. So here we see a much later example at the Fort of Graça in Portugal, which was built in the late 1700s. So really over the course of 2 centuries, they remain the preferred military architectural development to deal with new advances in cannonry. But as we've already discussed, Livorno was extraordinary for cultural as well as military reasons. Visitors to the city often remarked on its cosmopolitan nature, the wide variety of people of all faiths and ethnicities who mingled there. And it was not only really the only port city where this kind of coexistence took place, far from it. In the Ottoman Empire, for example, in the city of Smyrna, which is now Izmir, there was a sizable European community which flourished and conducted trade as it was protected by the capitulations. Again, we'll revisit this in a later section of the course, but it should be noted that while religious conflict certainly pervaded the Mediterranean in the 17th century, coexistence also warrants our attention. And your primary source for this week highlights some of the seemingly conflictual nature of coexistence and cosmopolitanism in Livorno in the late 16th and early 17th century. You will be reading a translation of the first 20 articles of the Livornian Constitution, which was again really a series of Grand Ducal decrees being issued in 1591 and 1593. So what we need to ask is, how does examining this document help us understand Tuscany and the Mediterranean in this period? And I will be posting discussion questions. I'm the discussion leader for this week. I will be posting those to the forum, and I very much look forward to reading your opinions.